This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. The fire that damaged the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris prompted an emotional response felt well beyond the banks of the Seine. Since the laying of the foundation stone by Pope Alexander III in 1163, this masterpiece of Gothic architecture has held a prominent place in French history and culture for 8 centuries. Here to help us explore the deeper role Notre Dame and other iconic structures around the world play in the societies that build them and beyond, we're joined by Lawrence Kuiper, Associate Professor in the Department of French, Italian, and Comparative Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Richard Leson, Associate Professor of Medieval Art and Architecture in UWM's Department of Art History, where his research and teaching interests include the art and architecture of the Middle Ages. Gentlemen, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks so much.
Well, let's begin with a few slides that kind of set the stage a bit. We've got sort of a rendering to just take a look at how the structure looked. And Richard, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the basic outlines from an architectural perspective.
Well, this is Gothic architecture entering its heyday. In the middle of the 12th century, the new architectural technology, which we now refer to as Gothic, began to take hold in Paris and the surrounding regions in the Ile-de-France. And it's funny because we have these discussions right now about this building as transcendent in terms of people's ability to associate with it from across confessional boundaries and international boundaries and so on. In the period that Gothic really developed, this style of architecture, which was groundbreaking, was known as the opus francogenum in the Latin, which means the French work. And it became really the first truly international architectural style in Northwestern Europe in the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th centuries. So it does have the French can really claim this as a development tied to French genius, if you will. The building itself, 1163, as you say, the foundation, or the dedication of the building by the Pope, but as has been said a lot in the news the past few days, the completion of the building took place over the course of several centuries. And it raises the question, is a cathedral building ever truly complete? I would take the opposite tack and say this is a building that has a life. It's continuously inhabited, it's employed, and while during some points in its history it may have experienced some unfortunate events, I think the most unfortunate we saw this Monday, it will continue to change as people use it, as they occupy it, and as its meaning, as it comes to mean new and different things for society.
Well, let's go to the next slide if we could, and here's a photograph, a very early photograph from 1865. So really hasn't changed much with the exception of the spire, which if we actually could go to the next slide, that's earlier this week in a happier time, and then go a bit further. That was the interior, and then the fire. And much was made of the loss of the spire, but in fact that was not part of the original design. Larry, you talk a little bit about that?
Well, right. So the spire itself was reconstructed in the 1850s by a prominent architect of the time named Viollet-le-Duc, who had been employed by the French Minister of or Inspector General of Historical Monuments, I want to get the title right there, to restore the entire cathedral at that time.
And that was actually somewhat driven by Victor Hugo's work, was it not?
Exactly. So Victor Hugo published in 1831 his world-renowned novel called The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English, but just called Notre Dame de Paris in French. So, highlighting the fact that for Hugo, the novel was as much about the structure as it was about the story that he was telling in the structure. And then a few years after Notre Dame de Paris came out, Hugo published a kind of a treatise about what France ought to be doing with its monuments. He talked about, he said, in Paris, vandalism flourishes and prospers before our eyes. He says, vandalism is an architect. Vandalism settles in and lounges. It's celebrated, applauded, encouraged, admired, caressed, protected, consulted, subsidized, defrayed, and normalized. This is my translation, so if anybody wants to call me out on that, but it's roughly right. And in the end, he keeps going back to Notre Dame de Paris as this sort of visceral structure that really we need to think about protecting.
Which had gotten a bit dodgy by then, right?
Yeah, yep. He says, he says, every day vandalism demolishes a little something that remains of us, of that admirable old Paris. What do I know? Vandalism whitewashed Notre Dame, touched up the Palais de Justice, raised Saint-Magloire, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's speaking from a moment when the revolution, the beginning of a sort of modernist spirit in France, or the culmination maybe of a sort of modernist spirit in a way, has taken the number of beautiful large churches in Paris down from around 300 to somewhere in the 90s in Paris at that time. And so he's really reacting to something that has become a strong trend during his lifetime and trying to get them to stop.
Well, and it's interesting that he's somehow equating the loss of those structures with a diminution of French identity somehow.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we could just take a look at our next slide here, some of the aftermath of the fire. So you'll see the inside's extensively damaged. But then beyond that, if we go to the next one, here's just an example of some of the items around the cathedral that are available. So it's interesting. You can buy coins and paperweights and bookends and spoons. And, finally, if we could just go to the final quote here. This is the actress Jennifer Beals, who posted on social media immediately afterwards and said, "Dear Paris, I send you all my love and condolences." And this is the significant part. "I feel like I've watched a dear friend suffer and die. I never knew how much she meant to me. I cry for her, for me, for all of you who knew and loved her best." So what about that? Why does the loss of a structure, a bit of building, have the impact of watching a friend suffer and die?
Well, when I've been having this conversation in my classes for the past week, and I would liken it to something simple as your childhood home. And if you see it go up in flames, you're profoundly moved by it because you feel as if it's a part of your family, as if it's an actor in your life. And here is a structure, Notre Dame de Paris, but also the other Gothic cathedrals of the age from the 12th and the 13th centuries, that partook of this new Gothic architectural style, but that also through their sculptural and stained glass window decoration spoke to local ritual, local identity. From the get-go, these things were very much about the local populace. Notre Dame de Paris, for the reasons, a variety of reasons, managed to largely survive the revolution, miraculously survived the world wars, and because it's in the capital and stands as this emblem of the capital, it's sort of consummate. It's a consummate expression now of what it means to be French. But in this week, we've seen how that definition of what it means to be French has expanded in a dramatic way, which maybe we just didn't really understand until this disaster took place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and Richard can speak more to the idea of how the cathedral was built as part of the everyday when it was built. It was meant to be a living, breathing organism for those people, but it never, even though we're far removed from the moment it was built, it never really lost that function in Parisian life, I don't think. And then by extension in French life, because that which is Parisian is generally French. 1 in 6 French people live in Paris, but more like 5 in 6 pass through Paris and live there at some time during their life.
So for viewers who may not have had the opportunity to travel to Paris, what would you see prior to this recent disaster on any given day in the precincts of Notre Dame?
Well, it's in the very center of town. They have music concerts, not just in the cathedral, but out front during the Festival of Music. It's a very common place for people to say, oh, let's all get together, let's meet there and then go somewhere. So it's a sort of a place where people gather. But of course, and this is part of the other thing too, Paris is I don't want to overstate it, but I don't think I will be by saying it's the most visited tourist city in the world. And so if you go to Paris, you go to Notre Dame. And so that's, I think, part of the reaction you saw worldwide, is that so many people went to Notre Dame, and seeing a place like that is an unforgettable experience, no matter where you came from. And so it's not just about Frenchness, right? There's more to it than that, I think.
Well, I'd like to touch a little bit on just the longevity of these structures. I mean, 800 years is a fairly long time, after all. There was a Croatian author, Slavenka Drakulic, who was talking about a bridge, a much celebrated, very old bridge in her area that had been damaged. And she had an interesting observation, like your thoughts on it. She said, "We expect people to die. We count on our own lives to end. The destruction of a monument to civilization is something else. The bridge, in this case, in all its beauty and grace, was built to outlive us, and it was an attempt to grasp eternity." Well, what about that? I mean, are we building for eternity?
I think at the time that they were constructing these things, the answer to that has to be yes. The survival of the Paris Cathedral for 850 years is a truly remarkable thing, though. Especially when, Larry's mentioning the period of the revolution and the aftermath, when really it was falling into a state of serious disrepair. And had there not been an intervention by Viollet-le-Duc at that time to shore up some of the structural problems, look, this is a limestone and wood building. Eventually it's going to collapse. The longevity of the building, this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but Larry and I were discussing yesterday the tragedy of the fire on the one hand, but as the director of the Medieval Academy of America, a big nerd organization, said in her statement to the membership this week, the stone vaults of the building actually did what they were designed to do, and that is to protect the interior of the cathedral, the nave, the transept, and all of the priceless things that entails. So this structure, in a way, the technology of the 12th, 13th century has served it for a long time and has even, you could argue, saved the salient portions of that building here in this moment. And we're now going to have this long debate about how to reconstruct it, what sort of technology to use. Should it be authentic? Should we use the medieval methods and so on? But I foresee that it will be around for much, much longer. And the outpouring of grief that we saw this week throughout the world, and especially in these extremely moving pictures from the city of Paris itself, I think is a confirmation that that will be the case.
Well, and to your point about, the specifics of the repair or renovation or whatever, I mean, that's a question. Is Is it that important to have it be exactly as it was 850 years ago, or is it the presence of this structure on this site that would serve the same role? I mean, if you use something that was not absolutely authentic, does it somehow diminish what this structure is?
Well, that's the question, right? I mean, which Notre Dame de Paris do you reconstruct, right? I mean, let's not forget that, as Richard pointed out, this structure replaced an older structure that was ordered razed to the ground by the Bishop of Paris, by Sully. In 1860, he said, well, we want a new cathedral, let's get rid of this old one. Whereas, around France, especially in southern France, there are all kinds of Romanesque cathedrals that are considered in their own right beautiful structures to be conserved. So this cathedral changed over time a lot. As we were talking about Viollet-le-Duc, he rebuilt the spire that everyone was upset to see crashing down, including me. Nobody wants to see something like that happen. But now Viollet-le-Duc reconstructed that spire in exaggerated proportion to what the original 12th century spire was.
So there were people who were probably horrified when he put it up. And
there were. He was highly criticized for that. So now, do we rebuild the Viollet-le-Duc spire, or do we rebuild the original 12th century spire?
Right. And I think to an earlier point that Larry made, our conception of this building is so much at this point informed by Hugo and Viollet-le-Duc, and so so much so that the first slide that we showed here, this is not a medieval work of sculpture we're looking at, but one of the famous gargoyles that were set up under Viollet-le-Duc's project. So the romanticism, if you will, that we associate with Notre Dame, that's something that people relate to very strongly. Our notion of Paris as a tourist destination and so on is tied to this 19th century, arguably this 19th century version of the cathedral, and the negotiation of that against this notion of 12th or 13th century authenticity is going to be a fascinating thing to see play out over the next several years indeed.
So let's broaden it out a little bit beyond Paris, beyond France. What imbues a structure with that sort of status in a culture, do you think? I mean, is there any commonality if you look at what people would identify as like the great buildings around the world? Is there anything that a thread that runs through all of them?
Longevity is certainly a part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think longevity makes a big difference.
And what about just the function in society? I mean, generally you find these buildings are very much tied in with daily life, as we've talked a little bit about,
They're tied in with daily life. I mean, think about, the great pyramids of Egypt. They were also tied in with a ritual and spiritual function. And it's largely for that reason that they've survived, many of these for as long as they have. So while this moment we sort of realize or sort of come to terms with the fact that that original function has changed in an interesting way, I think we do need to acknowledge that as an integral part of these buildings. And that really, to me, I mean, that's why I'm an art historian. And it speaks to the work that both Larry and I do as humanities professors, is sharing that kind of story and trying to answer that very difficult question.
I mean, it has to do with, it's tied in with the notion of modernity as well, right? I mean, there needed to be a moment, a tipping point in a sense, that Hugo had felt in his own, obviously had felt when he started writing about this so vehemently. And when Prosper Mérimée, the Inspector General, decided to go and start preserving all of these monuments all over France, he had a list of, by the end of his career, 2,800 that he wanted preserved, something like that. There had to be a moment where this age of these buildings became a connection to something that maybe in modernity people felt like they were losing. I think that's a part of it too.
Well, and it's worth noting that much like the spire when it was built as part of the renovation, things that have become iconic were not necessarily met with rave reviews initially. And then I'm thinking in the case of the Eiffel Tower, the author de Maupassant said of the Eiffel Tower, "Its useless and monstrous structure whose hateful shadow will overwhelm Paris's finer monuments." So talk a little bit about that. I mean, it's like, obviously, there were not rave reviews for the Eiffel Tower.
That's right. Eiffel himself had to do a lot of hard campaigning to keep the tower up. They were intending to tear it down after the World's Fair. He did experiments from it. He put a radio tower up there to show how it could be used for things like that. He was trying to find ways to show that it would be useful because people didn't see it as beautiful. But now,
right, imagine saying, well, we're just going to tear it down.
yeah, and it's there, and it's regarded for its beauty. You know, it's not seen as an eyesore like it was at the time. So,
well, before we go, we should talk a little bit about what happens next. President Macron has set a very ambitious, some people say unrealistic timeline of having the renovation and reconstruction done in time for the 2024 Olympics. Some people say, well, that's probably not going to happen, but the world has opened its purse strings. There's something in excess of $1 billion now pledged for the reconstruction. So what about just the ability to do that? I mean, are the kinds of skilled tradesmen that put it up in the first place still available?
Well, this again gets to this question of authenticity in reconstruction. And I had a colleague, he passed away 4 years ago. It was this young and promising architectural historian. And it's come out on the news, that he, only about 4 or 5 years ago, came into Notre Dame with kind of laser mapping technology and set this up in the middle of the crossing. And in a way that I would liken to, I suppose, sonar, but with lasers. You can tell I'm not really a technology person. Was able to record the precise dimensions of the interior of the structure, the distances, every single distance that you might want to measure now exists in the form of data. And I'm sure that that's going to be used in some respects in the reconstruction of this interior. But then, do you want to use the same materials that were used by the Masons in the 12th and the 13th century to construct the vaults? Or do you want to prevent against fires in a way that we can do in the 21st century? The question of speed is an interesting one. I'm reminded of the famous reconstruction of the Basilica of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople under the Emperor Justinian. After a calamity, a fire, a riot, the enormous building was reconstructed in only 5 years, famously so. And it was done because the emperor, the Macron of the day, I suppose, understood that it was necessary to do this for the people, for morale, for the spirit of Constantinople, as it were. I'll just say one more thing about that. I understand that it's important to affirm for the world that this monument has stood, that we can recreate it, that history hasn't ended, as it were. But there are things to be gained from this moment. Larry and I were discussing yesterday the architectural importance of this monument. In the 13th century, they introduced the flying buttress technology in the late 12th and 13th century. Notre Dame is at the center of this discussion. Was it the first place where they used that technology that really separated the Gothic from the art historical period that came before it? That's a debate that continues. And I wonder if the destruction, the unfortunate destruction of the vaults, might provide us a happy opportunity to put some of these questions about the flying buttress technology and its development here at Notre Dame to rest finally. So in that respect, maybe we should take a little bit more time to study what we can and not hasten to
cover
complete.
it all up.
Yeah.
Well, we've got just about a minute left, but I wanted to touch on something. If this structure is somehow emblematic of Frenchness, if you will, what about a France that's 5% Muslim? What about a France that has the yellow vest movement? What about, you know, all the other things that we associate with 21st century France? Can this serve that same function today?
Well, you know, that's a good question. France the French society right now is very fractured politically. I think politically it's a place that is going through some of the same problems that we're going through here. But a place like Notre Dame is, in its essence, the way that it was built, the reason that it was built, and so on, is meant to bring people together. It's not a religious monument for most people anymore. For most French people at this point, it's a monument of everyday activity, and it cuts its shape into the Parisian sky and says, "Here I am. You know, I'm still here and still solid, and we can do this." And so, I think it's got the potential to be a unifying symbol, even through all the strife. But maybe I'm more optimistic than other people are.
Well, optimistic or not, you got the last word. So.
Oh, jeez.
Larry Kuiper, thank you so much. Richard Leson.
Thank you, Doug.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.